The 24th of May 1941. 6 hours. The Denmark Strait. Two giants of the Steel Age are locked in a duel that will decide the fate of the Atlantic. On one side, the Bismarck, the pride of the Kriegsmarine and a modern marvel of German engineering. On the other, the HMS Hood, the mighty Hood. For 20 years, she wasn't just a ship. She was the physical manifestation of the British Empire, a floating fortress that represented the global reach of the Royal Navy. But in less than 8 minutes of combat, the unthinkable happens. A sudden, silent flash erupts from her midships, followed by a massive pillar of fire reaching 1,000 feet into the gray sky. In just 3 minutes, a 46,000-ton Titan vanishes, taking 415 men with her. Only 3 survived. For decades, historians blamed bad luck or the Bismarck's superior optics, but the truth is far more clinical. The Hood didn't die because of a lucky shot. She died because of a 1-inch fatal flaw, a compromise in steel made 25 years earlier that the Royal Navy knew about but chose to ignore. To understand the death of the Hood, we have to go back to 1916. The world is at war, and the Royal Navy is obsessed with one concept: speed. The man behind this obsession was Admiral Jackie Fisher, whose mantra was simple: speed is armor. This philosophy gave birth to the battlecruiser. The idea was to take the massive 15-inch guns of a battleship but strip away the heavy, cumbersome armor. This would allow the ship to outrun anything it couldn't outgun. When the HMS Hood was laid down in September 1916, she was meant to be the lead ship of the Admiral class. She was massive, 860 feet long, capable of 32 knots, and undeniably beautiful. With her long, low profile and 4 massive twin turrets, she looked invincible. But while the Hood was under construction, the Battle of Jutland changed everything. In a single afternoon, the British lost 3 battlecruisers to magazine explosions. They were glass cannons, leading Admiral David Beatty to famously remark, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." What was wrong was the horizontal protection. The Admiralty panicked and realized that long-range naval gunnery meant shells weren't hitting the thick belt armor on the sides of the ship. Instead, they were falling from the sky at steep angles, a phenomenon known as plunging fire. They halted construction on the Hood to add more protection, thickening the main belt to 12 inches and increasing the weight by 5,000 tons. However, you can only bolt so much steel onto a hull before you compromise buoyancy. The designers focused on the side armor, but the deck armor, the horizontal shield meant to stop shells falling from above, was left dangerously thin. In most critical areas over the magazines, the primary protective deck was only 3 inches thick. In certain transition zones where the armor sloped or met the side belt, that protection thinned out even more. In some spots, it was a mere 1 inch of high-tensile steel. In 1920, the Hood was the largest warship in the world, a fortress to the public but a known compromise to the engineers. For 20 years, the Hood was the showboat of the Navy, the ultimate diplomatic tool used to impress world powers. But while she was busy hosting parties and showing the flag, naval technology was sprinting past her. By the late 1932, the Hood was an aging veteran with tired engines and an obsolete armor scheme. Plans for a great refit in 1939 would have replaced her light deck plating with 5 or 6 inches of modern cemented armor, but the invasion of Poland canceled those plans. The Hood went into World War II with the same 1-inch and 3-inch deck vulnerabilities she had in 1920. She was a World War I ship forced to fight the Bismarck, a modern monster. In May 1941, Admiral Lancelot Holland, aboard the Hood, was ordered to intercept the Bismarck before it reached the Atlantic convoy lanes. Holland knew his ship's weakness. He knew that at long range, the Bismarck's 15-inch shells would take a high, looping trajectory and come crashing straight down through his thin decks. His strategy was desperate: close the distance fast. If he could get close enough, the trajectory of the German shells would flatten out, hitting his 12-inch side belt instead of his vulnerable roof. It was a race against time to cross the danger zone, the distance between 20,000 and 15,000 yards, where plunging fire was most lethal. The Hood charged forward at 28 knots, but at 5:52, the Bismarck opened fire, and the most analyzed 5 minutes in naval history began. As the clock struck 5:53, the Hood, and the newly commissioned HMS Prince of Wales began their high-speed approach. Admiral Holland's tactical situation was precarious. Because he was charging nearly head-on to close the distance, only his forward guns could be brought to bear, cutting his firepower in half. Meanwhile, the Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen were oriented broadside, allowing them to utilize every single gun in their batteries. The Germans found the range with terrifying speed. The first several salvos from the Prinz Eugen struck the Hood's boat deck, igniting a massive fire among the 4-inch anti-aircraft ammunition and unrotated projectile rocket launchers. To the men on the Prince of Wales, the Hood appeared to be burning uncontrollably amidships, but this was a superficial wound, a distraction from the kinetic nightmare about to descend from the sky. The Bismarck's fifth salvo was the killing blow. At a range of approximately 16,500 yards, the German 15-inch shells were still falling at a steep angle of descent. Forensic ballistics suggest that at least one, and possibly two, shells struck the Hood near the mainmast. This is where the 1-inch fatal flaw becomes the center of the tragedy. To reach the 15-inch magazines, a shell would have to pass through multiple layers of protective plating. The Hood's upper decks were composed of relatively thin, high-tensile steel, designed more for structural integrity than ballistic resistance. Once the Bismarck's shell pierced the thin weather deck, it encountered the 0.75-inch to 1.5-inch forecastle deck. To a 1,760-pound shell traveling at supersonic speeds, this steel offered almost zero resistance. It didn't even trigger the shell's fuse. It simply let it pass through, deeper into the ship's vitals. The shell then reached the internal armored deck, which, in the area surrounding the after magazines, was only 3 inches thick. Historically, many naval architects argued that this should have been enough to deflect a shell, but they failed to account for the angle of obliquity. Because the Hood was turning to bring her rear guns into action at the exact moment of impact, the angle of the ship's hull actually made the armor thinner relative to the shell's path. The shell punched through the 3-inch plate as if it were tin foil. Below this lay the 4-inch shell room and the massive 15-inch powder magazines, filled with tons of cordite, the highly flammable propellant used to fire the main guns. What happened next was a terrifying chain reaction known as a deflagration. Unlike a high explosive burst that happens instantly, cordite burns with incredible intensity and speed. Eyewitnesses on the Prince of Wales and the Bismarck described seeing a thin pillar of fire shoot up from the vicinity of the mainmast, followed almost instantly by a massive, silent expansion of white-hot gas. The pressure inside the ship built up so rapidly that it had nowhere to go. The weak point was the 1-inch and 2-inch plating of the ship's side and deck transitions. The explosion literally tore the Hood in half, venting through the weakest parts of the superstructure. The stern section was blown clean off, and the bow rose high into the air, the forward guns firing one last, desperate salvo as the ship began its final plunge. The speed of the sinking was so absolute that there was no time for lifeboats, no time for abandoned ship orders, and no time for the men below decks to even realize the hull had been breached. In just 180 seconds, the largest warship in the world was gone. When the HMS Electra arrived on the scene hours later to search for survivors, they expected to find hundreds of men in the water. Instead, they found only 3: Ted Briggs, Bob Tilburn, and Bill Dundas. They were the only witnesses to the internal collapse of a legend. The subsequent Admiralty boards of inquiry would spend years debating whether it was a direct hit to the magazine or a fire that spread through the vents, but the forensic reality remains. The Hood was armored against a type of warfare that no longer existed by 1941. Decades later, when David Mearns discovered the wreck of the Hood in 2001, the debris field confirmed the fatal flaw theory. The ship didn't just sink, it had been eviscerated from the inside out. The midsection was almost entirely missing, reduced to a field of shattered steel plates. The investigation showed that the explosion had occurred in the after magazines and then traveled forward through the 4-inch ammunition passageways, effectively unzipping the ship along its weakest structural points. It was a sobering reminder that in naval engineering, a single inch of steel can be the difference between a minor repair and a national catastrophe. The mighty Hood died not because she was outclassed by the Bismarck's bravery, but because she was a victim of a design philosophy that prioritized the appearance of invincibility over the reality of modern ballistics. The loss of the Hood sent a shockwave through the British Admiralty that bordered on pure, unadulterated panic. For 20 years, The British public had been told that the Hood was the ultimate guardian of the seas. To have her destroyed in seconds by a single German ship was not just a military setback, it was an existential threat to the morale of the British Empire. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's response was immediate and legendary in its brevity: sink the Bismarck. This wasn't just a tactical order, it was a necessity for national survival. Every available ship in the North Atlantic, from battleships to destroyers and even the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, was diverted from their duties with one singular purpose: to hunt down the ship that had exposed the Royal Navy's vulnerability. The subsequent destruction of the Bismarck only 3 days later is often framed as a vengeful triumph, but for the engineers and naval architects back in London, the celebration was muted by a terrifying realization. The Bismarck had taken hundreds of hits from 14-inch and 16-inch shells and stayed afloat for hours, eventually needing to be scuttled by her own crew. The Hood, meanwhile, had folded under the first serious blow. This discrepancy highlighted the radical shift in all-or-nothing armor schemes. The German design utilized a turtle deck arrangement that made it nearly impossible to hit their magazines at close range, whereas the British battlecruiser design was a relic of an era that vastly underestimated the penetration power of modern high-velocity capped shells. In the years following the disaster, 2 separate boards of inquiry were held to determine the exact cause of the loss. The first was criticized for being too hasty, but the second, the Bucknell Inquiry, delved deeper into the technical failures. They examined the 1-inch fatal flaw with clinical precision. They looked at the 4-inch magazines, which were situated above the 15-inch magazines, separated by only thin plating. They concluded that the Bismarck shell likely initiated a fire in the 4-inch magazines that then flashed down into the main 15-inch stores. However, the underlying truth remained: no matter which magazine blew first, the shell should never have been able to reach them. The Hood was a victim of weight-saving measures that had traded vertical protection for an extra 2 knots of speed, a trade that proved fatal when the engagement range exceeded 15,000 yards. The legacy of the HMS Hood changed the way warships were built forever. The era of the battlecruiser as a distinct, lightly armored class died in the Denmark Strait. Post-war analysis led to the development of the fast battleship concept, where speed was achieved through more efficient high-pressure steam turbines rather than by sacrificing steel. Modern naval vessels transitioned toward defensive systems like point defense and electronic warfare. But the lesson of the Hood, that a ship is only as strong as its weakest horizontal plate, remains a duel, foundational principle in damage control and survivability. Engineers realized that in the age of long-range engagement, the roof of the ship is just as important as the walls. Today, the Hood lies in 3 major sections at the bottom of the Atlantic, 2,800 meters down. Her 15-inch guns, which once symbolized the height of British power, are now silent monuments to 1,415 sailors. The wreck serves as a final, haunting confirmation of the data. The 1-inch fatal flaw wasn't just a technical oversight, it was a symptom of an empire that was slow to adapt to a rapidly changing technological landscape. The mighty Hood was designed to be the fastest and most imposing ship of the 1,920 seconds, but she was never truly ready for the 1,940 seconds. She remains a powerful reminder to every naval architect and historian that in the cold math of naval warfare, there is no such thing as good enough when it comes to protecting the men inside the steel. To reach the depth of analysis required for a definitive maritime disaster study, we must look beyond the moment of the explosion and scrutinize the systemic failures in British naval architecture that existed for decades before the first shell was fired. The tragic irony of the HMS Hood is that she was perhaps the most modified ship of her era, yet none of those modifications addressed the core structural rot at the heart of her design. After the Battle of Jutland in 1916, the Royal Navy was acutely aware that their battlecruisers were prone to catastrophic flash fires, where a hit to a turret would send a flame down the ammunition hoist and ignite the magazine. In response, they fitted the Hood with additional fire doors and flash-tight seals. But these were internal band-aids. They did nothing to stop a heavy-caliber shell from physically entering the magazine space through the deck. The 1-inch fatal flaw was not just a single piece of plating. It was a cumulative failure of horizontal protection that spanned the entire length of the ship's vitals. When we examine the metallurgical data of the era, the tragedy deepens. The high tensile steel used in much of the Hood's non-armored structure was designed to flex and provide strength for the massive hull, but it offered almost no ballistic resistance against the German 38 centimeters, 15-inch PS Gur L44 armor-piercing shells. These shells were equipped with a delayed action base fuse. This meant the shell was designed to punch through a layer of steel, wait a few milliseconds while it traveled 30 or 40 feet into the ship's interior, and then detonate. On the morning of May 24, the Hood's thin upper decks acted as a triggering mechanism rather than a shield. They were just thick enough to arm the Bismarck's fuses, but not thick enough to slow the shells down. Effectively, the Hood's own structure helped the German shells reach her heart by ensuring they exploded only once they were deep inside the hull, nestled among the cordite charges. The technical community often debates the golden hit theory, the idea that the shell followed a path through an incredibly narrow window of vulnerability. However, a statistical analysis of the Hood's armor profile reveals that it ranges between 15,000 and 25,000 yards. Nearly 60% of her deck area was vulnerable to penetration by a 15-inch shell. This wasn't a 1 in a million shot, it was a mathematical probability. Admiral Holland was essentially gambling with the lives of his crew the moment he entered the engagement. His decision to close the range was tactically sound based on the data he had, but he was fighting against the physics of his own vessel. The Hood was also wet. She sat low in the water because of the extra 5,000 tons of armor added during construction, which meant her stern was often awash in heavy seas. This extra weight also meant that her A and B decks, the very layers meant to protect the magazines, were actually lower in the hull than originally designed, potentially changing the angle of impact in ways the designers never anticipated in their 1916 slide rule calculations. Furthermore, the chemical composition of the British propellant, cordite MD, played a significant role in the totality of the disaster. Cordite was notoriously unstable when compared to the German RPC 32 propellant. When cordite ignites, it doesn't just burn, it produces an enormous volume of gas almost instantaneously, creating a pressure wave that the ship's internal bulkheads were never designed to contain. In the case of the Hood, the explosion in the rear magazine likely triggered a sympathetic detonation in the adjacent 4-inch magazines. The resulting fireball traveled through the ship's ventilation trunking and glory holes, small access points used by the crew acting like a flamethrower through the interior of the ship. This explains why witnesses saw fire erupting from the forward vents seconds before the ship broke apart. The Hood was essentially a giant pipe bomb, and the 1-inch plating was the weak seal that allowed the pressure to rip the entire structure to pieces. The human cost of this engineering failure is the most haunting aspect of the data. Of the 1,415 men lost, hundreds were likely killed instantly by the overpressure of the blast, but many more were trapped in the bow and stern sections as they sank. The 3 survivors described a scene of surreal silence following the blast, a darkening of the sky as the debris blocked out the sun. The fact that only 3 men emerged from a crew of over 1,400 is a statistical anomaly in naval history, even for a ship that sank quickly. It points to a total structural collapse that left no path to the surface. For the families of the lost, the mighty Hood was a symbol of security, but for the men who served in her, there had always been a lingering lower-deck rumor that the ship was a coffin if she ever had to face a modern battleship. The sailors knew what the Admiralty tried to hide. The ship was overworked, under-armored, and out of time. In the broader context of maritime history, the Hood stands as the final lesson in the danger of prestige over performance. Throughout the 1,930 seconds, the Royal Navy refused to take the Hood out of service for the necessary 3-year reconstruction because she was too valuable as a propaganda tool. They prioritized the appearance of power over the reality of protection. Had the Hood received her great refit in 1939, her deck armor would have been doubled, her internal subdivided bulkheads reinforced, and her magazines moved deeper into the hull. She likely would have survived the hit from the Bismarck, suffering heavy damage but remaining a fighting unit. The 1-inch fatal flaw was therefore not just an engineering mistake, it was a political one. It was the result of a navy trying to maintain a global empire on a budget, using aging steel to do a young man's job. Today, as we analyze the wrecks of the past with modern sonar and 3D modeling, the Hood serves as a case study for normal accident theory in complex systems. It wasn't one thing that killed the Hood. It was a tightly coupled chain of events. It was the decision to use cordite, the decision to prioritize speed in 1916, the decision to cancel the 1939 refit, and the tactical decision to turn the ship at 5:59. When these factors aligned, the 1-inch plating became the final, failing link in the chain. The tragedy of the Denmark Strait is a sobering reminder for modern engineering. We can build the most magnificent structures in the world, but if we ignore the fundamental laws of physics and the warnings of the past, the fatal flaw will always be there, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Hood remains at the bottom of the Atlantic, not as a victim of the Bismarck, but as a monument to the high price of compromise.